After working as a housekeeper for wealthy families for nearly 40 years, I spent my entire life savings to put my son Edward through medical school. When his wedding invitation arrived, addressed only to Eleanor Thompson house staff, I realized the boy I'd sacrificed everything for was ashamed to call me his mother. My name is Eleanor Thompson, but everyone in Magnolia Creek calls me Miss Ellie. I've spent most of my life cleaning other people's homes, making sure their silver shined, and their linens were pressed just so. It wasn't the life I'd dreamed of as a young girl, but dreams have a way of changing when life throws its curveballs at you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I was barely 20 when I found myself widowed with a 3-month-old baby boy. My husband Robert had been working construction when a support beam gave way. The company paid for the funeral and gave me a small settlement, but it wasn't nearly enough to build a life on. My parents had passed years before, and Robert's family blamed me for taking him away to Magnolia Creek in the first place. I was on my own with little Edward, with nothing but my high school diploma and a determination to give my son the chances I never had. The Harrington family was the first to hire me. Old Mrs. Harrington needed someone to help maintain her sprawling Victorian on Sycamore Street after her husband passed. She took one look at me standing on her porch with Edward bundled in my arms and said, "Well, I suppose the boy can stay in the sunroom while you work." That arrangement lasted 15 years, until Mrs. Harrington passed in her sleep and her children sold the house. By then, Edward was in high school, showing remarkable intelligence that made my heart swell with pride. His science teacher, Mr. Abernathy, told me Edward had a brilliant mind that shouldn't go to waste. "This boy could be a doctor someday," he said during a parent-teacher conference. I nodded and smiled, not daring to speak the thoughts racing through my mind. How would a housekeeper pay for medical school? That night, I made a decision that would shape the next 25 years of my life. I took on a second cleaning job with the Donnellys across town, then a third with Dr. Marshall's family on weekends. I worked 16-hour days, my hands cracking. From the cleaning chemicals, my back aching as I scrubbed floors and hauled laundry baskets, I opened a special savings account labeled Edward's Future and deposited every extra penny. When Edward was accepted to Westridge University with a partial scholarship, I cried tears of joy. That night, I took out the old cookie tin where I kept my most precious possessions. Robert's wedding ring, the only photo I had of my parents, and the business card of a real estate agent I'd met years ago. "I'm going to sell the house," I told Edward over our celebration dinner of pot roast, his favorite. "Mom, no," he protested, his fork clattering against his plate. "That's all we have from Dad." The little 2-bedroom craftsman had been Robert's pride and joy. He'd spent weekends fixing the porch steps and painting the shutters, dreaming of the family we'd raised there. I'd held on to it through lean years when selling would have made financial sense, paying the mortgage with whatever I could scrape together. "Your father would want this," I said firmly. "He'd want you to become the man you're meant to be." Edward hugged me that night, his lanky teenage frame engulfing mine. "I'll make you proud, Mom, I promise." And for many years, he did. He called weekly from university, telling me about his classes and the friends he was making. When he was accepted to medical school, he drove 5 hours home just to tell me in person. I took out my secret savings and handed him a cashier's check that represented decades of extra shifts and denied small pleasures. "Mom, this is too much," he said, his eyes wide at the amount. "It's what I've been saving for," I replied simply. Something changed during those medical school years. The calls became less frequent, shorter when they did come. He spent holidays with his classmates, explaining that he needed to study or couldn't afford the trip home. I told myself it was natural, that he was building his own life in a world very different from our little town. Then he met Vanessa Blackwell during his residency. I learned about her from a brief email. "Mom, I've met someone special. Her name is Vanessa. Her father is chief of surgery. 3 months later, another email announced their engagement, with a casual mention that the wedding would be at the Blackwell Estate in Charleston. I waited for the formal invitation, imagining how I'd look in the pale blue dress I'd been saving for a special occasion. When the thick cream envelope finally arrived, I opened it with trembling fingers, only to find my name written as Eleanor Thompson, house staff, with no mention of being the mother of the groom. I called Edward immediately. "There must be some mistake with the invitation," I said, trying to keep my voice light. A long pause followed. "Mom," he finally said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Vanessa's family is very particular about appearances. They think I'm from a different background." "What background is that?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "I told them my mother was a household manager for an estate in Georgia," he said. The words hung between us, the implications crystal clear. "I see," I said, the pain so sharp I could barely breathe. "And would this household manager be attending as a guest or as staff?" Another pause. "Mom, maybe it would be better if you didn't come. The Blackwells have hired a photography team to document everything for Southern Living magazine. It's a really big opportunity for Vanessa's event planning business." "I'm your mother, Edward," I said, my voice breaking despite my best efforts. "The only parent you have left. And I love you," he said quickly. "But this wedding isn't really about us. It's about connections and impressions. Vanessa's father could make my entire career. Please try to understand." After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for hours, the invitation mocking me from where it lay. The boy I had sacrificed everything for, my youth, my health, my own dreams, was ashamed of me. Of my work-worn hands and simple education. Of the very labor that had given him his opportunities. That night, I pulled out the cookie tin again and removed the last item I'd been saving, a small blue velvet box containing my grandmother's pearl earrings. I'd always planned to give them to Edward's bride, a family tradition stretching back generations. Now I wondered if Vanessa Blackwell would even accept such a modest gift from the help. As I held those pearls, gleaming softly in the lamplight, something shifted inside me. The hurt crystallized into resolve. I had spent my life putting Edward first, making myself small so he could grow tall. But I wouldn't be erased from his life story. Not like this. I picked up my phone and dialed my oldest friend, Ida Mae Johnson. Unlike me, Ida Mae had turned her cleaning business into a successful company, now managing staff for half the wealthy homes in 3 counties. "Ida," I said when she answered, "I need your help. My son's getting married, and apparently I'm just the hired help." "Oh, honey," she replied, her voice warm with understanding and cool with outrage. "Those fancy folks don't know who they're messing with." 2 weeks before the wedding, I received a call from Ida Mae that changed everything. "Ellie, you need to come to the Blackwell estate today. I've arranged for you to meet with the head housekeeper about some wedding preparations." "What are you talking about?" I asked, confused. "I'm not working this wedding." "Just trust me," Ida Mae said cryptically. "Wear something professional but not your usual cleaning clothes. I'll meet you at the service entrance at 2 o'clock. The Blackwell estate was even more imposing than I'd imagined. A sprawling antebellum mansion with perfect white columns and manicured gardens that stretched for acres. The kind of place I'd spent my life cleaning, but never thought I'd be connected to through family. Ida Mae was waiting for me as promised, dressed in her company's uniform, a crisp navy suit with Johnson Estate Services embroidered discreetly on the pocket. "The staff is having their lunch break," she explained, ushering me through a maze of corridors. "We don't have much time." "Time for what?" I whispered as we entered what appeared to be a small office. "To hear the truth," Ida Mae said grimly. She gestured to a chair beside the desk where a laptop sat open. "Marjorie is the Blackwell's personal assistant. She records all their meetings to transcribe notes later. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A woman I hadn't noticed before nodded at me from the corner. "Mrs. Thompson, I apologize for the subterfuge, but after what I overheard yesterday, I felt you had a right to know. My conscience wouldn't allow me to stay silent." "Know what?" I asked, a familiar dread building in my stomach. Marjorie clicked a few keys on the laptop. "This is from yesterday's meeting about final wedding arrangements." A video began playing, showing a lavish sitting room where Edward, Vanessa, and an older couple I assumed were the Blackwells sat reviewing documents. My heart clenched at the sight of my son. I hadn't seen him in person for nearly a year. "Now, about the seating chart," the older woman was saying. "Edward, we've put your family members at table 12, near the back but not too close to the kitchen. Will that work?" Edward shifted uncomfortably. "Actually, it's just my mother and she won't be attending." Vanessa reached over to squeeze his hand. "Darling, you don't have to be embarrassed. We've all agreed it's for the best." My breath caught in my throat. They had all agreed I shouldn't attend my own son's wedding? "Is she ill?" Mrs. Blackwell asked with practiced concern. "No," Edward replied. Well, the situation is complicated." Mr. Blackwell leaned forward. "Son, we've welcomed you into our family. There's no need for secrets. We know you come from humble beginnings. It's part of what makes your accomplishments so impressive." Edward nodded, seeming to gain confidence. "My mother has been a housekeeper all her life. She has no education beyond high school, no social connections, no refinement. She wouldn't be comfortable at an event like this. And more importantly," Vanessa added with a tight smile, "she would make others uncomfortable. The Andersons from the hospital board are coming, as are the partners from Daddy's golf club. This wedding is as much about your future career as it is about our marriage." "Precisely," Mrs. Blackwell nodded. "It's not personal, Edward. It's practical. People make judgments based on family connections. Having housekeeping staff presented as family would create confusion. My son, my beautiful boy who I'd given everything for, nodded in agreement. She'll understand. She's always put my future first. I've told her she's welcome to watch the ceremony from the staff area if she wants. The photographer won't go back there." The laptop screen blurred as my eyes filled with tears. I wanted to stop watching, but I couldn't look away. "What about the money she's contributed?" Mr. Blackwell asked. "You mentioned she insisted on paying for something?" Edward's expression brightened. "Oh, she's covering the floral arrangements. It's her gift to us." "How appropriate," Mrs. Blackwell remarked with a thin smile, "given her experience with domestic matters." Vanessa laughed lightly. "We'll need to have Richardson's rework everything anyway. I've seen her house. Her taste is exactly what you'd expect." The floral arrangements they were dismissing so casually had cost me $15,000. The last of my savings not already spent on Edward's education or the expensive watch I'd purchased as his wedding gift. I'd been so proud to contribute something meaningful to the celebration, believing it was my way of being part of this important day. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I couldn't focus on the words anymore. Marjorie quietly closed the laptop. "There's more," she said softly. "They've hired extra security specifically to watch for wedding crashers. Mr. Edward specifically described his mother and said she might try to insert herself into the ceremony despite being asked to stay away." I sat perfectly still, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. The pain was physical, radiating from my heart outward until my entire body felt cold and numb. "Why?" I finally whispered. "I gave him everything." Ida May knelt beside my chair, her warm hands covering mine. "Because he's ashamed of where he came from, Sugar. He's so desperate to belong in their world that he's willing to erase everything that doesn't fit their picture. I need to go." I said suddenly, standing up. The room felt too small, the air too thin. "Ellie, wait," Ida May called after me. "Don't do anything rash." I turned back, surprised to find my voice steady when I spoke. "I'm not going to make a scene if that's what you're worried about. I just need some time to think." As I drove home, memories flooded back. Edward as a toddler, falling asleep in the sunroom of the Harrington house while I cleaned. Edward, at 8, proudly showing me his science fair ribbon. Edward, at 18, hugging me goodbye as he left for college, promising he'd make me proud. Somewhere along the way, I had become something shameful to him, a secret to be hidden away, an embarrassment to his new identity. The pain of that realization was almost unbearable. When I reached my little house, I went straight to the closet where I'd been storing my outfit for the wedding. A modest, pale blue dress that had cost more than I'd spent on myself in years. I'd even bought new shoes to match and practiced walking in them, determined not to embarrass Edward with my usual practical flats. I took out the dress and laid it on my bed, smoothing the fabric with trembling hands. Then I reached for the phone and dialed my son's number. It went to voicemail after several rings. "Edward," I said, struggling to keep my voice from breaking. "It's Mom. I just wanted to let you know that I understand about the wedding. I won't embarrass you by attending. The final payment for the flowers has been made. I hope you and Vanessa will be very happy together." I hung up and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the blue dress. In that moment, something shifted inside me. A lifetime of accommodation and sacrifice hardening into resolve. If my son was ashamed of who I was, perhaps it was time I remembered exactly who that was. Not just a housekeeper or a mother, but a woman who had survived widowhood at 20, who had built a life from nothing, who had never needed anyone's approval or validation until now. I picked up the phone again and called Ida May back. "I've been thinking," I said when she answered, "about that job offer you mentioned last year." The job offer Ida May had extended last year was to become a partner in her business. With her connections and my reputation for meticulous work, she believed we could expand Johnson Estate Services into the wealthiest neighborhoods across 3 states. I had declined, not wanting to leave Edward without my support as he finished his residency. Now, with my newfound clarity, I was ready to reconsider. "You still want me as your partner?" I asked. "More than ever," Ida May replied without hesitation. "But Ellie, are you sure this isn't just a reaction to what you learned today?" "It's more than that," I said. "It's about who I am and what I deserve. I've spent my life making sure Edward had every opportunity. I don't regret that, but it's time I built something for myself too." We arranged to meet the following day to discuss details. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Edward's face as he calmly explained to the Blackwells why his mother wasn't fit to attend his wedding. The boy I had raised would never have spoken those words. Somewhere along the way, he had become someone I didn't recognize. My phone rang early the next morning. It was Edward. "Mom, I got your message," he said, his voice tense. "Are you really okay with not coming to the wedding?" I took a deep breath before answering. "I think we both know it's for the best, Edward." "Right," he said, relief evident in his tone. "I'm glad you understand. It's just, the Blackwells move in very particular circles and—" "You don't need to explain," I interrupted, unable to bear hearing those hurtful justifications again. "I know exactly how the Blackwells feel about people like me." There was a pause. "What does that mean?" "Nothing," I said quickly. "I'm happy you've found a family that can give you the connections you need for your career." "Mom, it's not like that," Edward protested, but his objection felt hollow. "I love Vanessa. This is about our future together." "Of course it is," I agreed, keeping my voice level. "And I want you to have the best future possible. That's all I've ever wanted." After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table, a strange calm settling over me. The conversation confirmed what I already knew. Edward had chosen his path, and it was one that deliberately excluded me. The pain was still there, a dull ache beneath my breastbone, but now it was accompanied by something else: determination. When I arrived at Ida May's office later that morning, I was surprised to find Marjorie from the Blackwell estate waiting as well. "I hope you don't mind," Ida May said. "Marjorie has some information that might interest you." Marjorie shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Mrs. Thompson, after you left yesterday, I felt terrible. I've worked for the Blackwells for 8 years, and I've never seen them treat anyone the way they're treating you, so I did some digging." She placed a folder on the desk between us. "This is the complete wedding budget. I thought you should see where your flower money is actually going." I opened the folder with trembling hands. The detailed spreadsheet showed every expense for the wedding, with my $15,000 contribution clearly marked. But it wasn't allocated to flowers at all. Instead, it had been divided between groom's wardrobe and honeymoon upgrade. "The flowers are being paid for by the Blackwells," Marjorie explained. "Mrs. Blackwell has a friend who owns Richardson's Floral Design. They're getting a substantial discount." I stared at the numbers, trying to make sense of this new betrayal. Edward had lied to me about how my money would be used, money that represented years of hard work and sacrifice. "There's more," Marjorie continued, her voice softer now. "I overheard a conversation between Edward and Vanessa yesterday evening. They were discussing your house." My head snapped up. "My house? What about it?" "Apparently, Edward has been telling Vanessa that you're planning to sell it and move to a retirement community after the wedding. He mentioned that the proceeds from the sale would be an appropriate wedding gift, considering how much her parents are spending on the ceremony." The room seemed to spin around me. My little house on Maple Street, the one Robert and I had purchased with such pride, where I'd raised our son, the only real asset I had to my name, was now being offered up as a wedding present without my knowledge or consent. "But I have no plans to sell my home," I said, my voice barely audible. Ida May reached across the desk to squeeze my hand. "We know that, sugar. But it seems your son has made plans on your behalf." "Why would he think—" I trailed off as a memory surfaced. Last Christmas, during Edward's brief visit home, he had casually mentioned that maintaining an older home was becoming too much for me. He had suggested looking into senior-friendly living arrangements and offered to help me find a nice little apartment closer to his new practice. I had dismissed the idea at the time, telling him I was perfectly capable of maintaining my own home. "He's counting on it," Marjorie said. "From what I heard, he's already spoken to a real estate agent about potential listing prices. They're expecting the money to help fund their new life together." A cold fury began to replace the shock and hurt. The depth of the deception was staggering. Not just excluding me from the wedding, but actively planning to profit from my absence. "Thank you for telling me," I said to Marjorie. "I know this couldn't have been easy for you." She nodded, gathering her things to leave. "I should get back before I'm missed. The Blackwells are hosting a pre-wedding dinner for the bridal party tonight." After Marjorie left, Ida May and I sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, she spoke. "What are you going to do, Ellie?" I thought about Edward's betrayal, about the Blackwells' dismissal of my life's work, about Vanessa's casual cruelty. I thought about the house that Robert and I had made into a home, that Edward now expected me to surrender without discussion. "First," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, "I'm going to call my bank and stop payment on that check for the flowers. Or rather, Edward's wardrobe and honeymoon upgrade." Ida May nodded approvingly. "And then?" "Then I'm going to become your business partner. But there's one condition. Our first client needs to be the Blackwell estate." Ida May's eyebrows shot up. "Are you sure that's wise, given the circumstances?" "I've spent 40 years cleaning other people's homes, Ida May. I know every trick, every technique, every product. I've restored antiques that professional conservators had given up on. I've removed stains that were supposedly permanent. I leaned forward, a plan taking shape as I spoke. No one knows how to take care of a house like that better than I do. And no one knows how to uncover secrets better than the person who cleans your home. A slow smile spread across Ida May's face. Marjorie did mention they're desperately short-staffed for the wedding weekend. Several of their regular housekeepers called out sick after Mrs. Blackwell was particularly demanding last week. What a fortunate coincidence, I replied, returning her smile. Johnson Estate Services would be happy to provide additional staff for such an important event. And what exactly are you hoping to find at the Blackwell estate? Ida May asked, though the gleam in her eyes suggested she already knew. The truth, I said simply. And once I have it, I'm going to make sure my son remembers exactly who his mother is. Not just a housekeeper, but a woman who taught him everything he knows about dignity, honesty, and respect. I paused, feeling a strange lightness despite the gravity of the situation. Values he seems to have forgotten while climbing the social ladder. Ida May nodded slowly. Well then, partner, let's get to work. The Blackwell estate was a flurry of activity 3 days before the wedding. Florists, caterers, and decorators moved purposefully through the grand rooms, transforming them for the wedding of the season. No one paid any attention to the middle-aged woman in the navy uniform who quietly polished silver and arranged fresh linens in the guest rooms. I had become invisible, exactly as I'd intended. Ida May had presented Johnson Estate Services as the premier staffing solution for elite homes, and the desperate Blackwells had hired us without question. Mrs. Blackwell barely glanced at me during the brief orientation, instead focusing all her attention on Ida May, who she clearly considered the only person worth addressing. We have very specific standards, Mrs. Blackwell had said, her chin tilted upward. Our regular staff understands the way things are done here. Rest assured, our team exceeds the highest standards, Ida May had replied smoothly. My associate here has over 40 years of experience with the finest homes in Georgia. She'll ensure everything is perfect. Mrs. Blackwell had merely nodded, already turning away to address more important concerns. That dismissal was precisely what gave me the freedom to move through the house unnoticed, to observe and listen as the family prepared for the wedding. By the afternoon of my second day at the estate, I had learned more about the Blackwells than they would ever have willingly revealed. I discovered that their impressive art collection included several pieces with questionable provenance, carefully kept away from appraisers' eyes. I found medications hidden in Mrs. Blackwell's vanity drawer that explained her erratic behavior, prescription, bottles with 3 different doctors' names on them. And most tellingly, I uncovered financial documents in Mr. Blackwell's study suggesting that the family's wealth was largely an illusion, maintained through increasing debt and desperate financial maneuvering. The Blackwells were not what they pretended to be. Their social status, their wealth, their perfect family image, all of it was as carefully constructed as a stage set, ready to collapse at the slightest disturbance. And Edward, my Edward, had been so thoroughly taken in that he was willing to sacrifice his own mother to be part of their illusion. I was dusting bookshelves in the main library when I overheard Edward and Mr. Blackwell in the adjacent study. Their voices carried through the partially open door, neither of them aware of my presence. The hospital board position is practically guaranteed, Mr. Blackwell was saying. James Anderson was quite impressed with you at the rehearsal dinner last night. He mentioned that they're looking for young blood with the right connections. I'm grateful for the opportunity, sir, Edward replied, his voice taking on that deferential tone I'd never heard before. It made my heart ache to hear my confident, principled son speaking like a subordinate seeking approval. Well, you're family now, or will be in a few days. Taking care of family is what the Blackwells do. There was the sound of ice clinking in crystal glasses. I moved silently closer to the door, careful to remain out of sight. Speaking of family, Mr. Blackwell continued. Have you sorted out that situation with your mother? My breath caught. I stood perfectly still, straining to hear Edward's response. Yes, sir. She won't be attending. I've made it clear that it would be inappropriate. Good, good. Vanessa was quite concerned. The Thompsons from Charleston will be seated at the front, and the confusion of having your mother, another Mrs. Thompson with such a different background, would be awkward to explain. I could almost see Edward nodding eagerly, desperate for approval. It's taken care of. My mother understands her place. The casual cruelty of those words stole my breath. My place. As if my value as his mother could be reduced to a social position. As if the woman who had sacrificed everything for him was nothing more than an inconvenient detail to be managed. And the house? Mr. Blackwell asked. Vanessa mentioned something about your mother's property. Yes, she's planning to sell. The market in that area has improved considerably, and the proceeds should be substantial. She's mentioned wanting to help us establish our new home. I gripped the bookshelf to steady myself. Another lie. I had never suggested selling my home. To help Edward and Vanessa establish theirs. The depth of his deception was staggering. Excellent, Mr. Blackwell replied. Vanessa has her eye on a property in Riverside. Nothing too extravagant, but suitable for a young doctor on the rise. Of course, we'd contribute as well, but having your mother's assistance would make it much more attainable. She's always been generous, Edward said, and I detected a note of discomfort in his voice, perhaps the first sign that some part of him recognized the wrongness of his actions. I don't want to pressure her, though. Mr. Blackwell laughed. Nonsense. From what? You've told me. She's lived a very simple life. What else would she do with the money? Far better to invest it in your future, her only son's future, than to waste it on herself at her age. I had heard enough. Silently, I gathered my cleaning supplies and slipped out of the library. I needed air, needed space to process this fresh betrayal. Not only was Edward excluding me from his wedding, but he was already spending my money, planning my future without my consent or input. In the grand entrance hall, I nearly collided with Vanessa and her mother. They were reviewing seating arrangements, and neither spared me a glance as I murmured an apology and stepped aside. I was nothing more than a piece of furniture to them, not worthy of acknowledgement. Daddy says the Anderson wedding cost nearly $500,000, Vanessa was saying. Ours has to be at least comparable. The photos for Southern Living need to be absolutely perfect. Mrs. Blackwell patted her daughter's hand. Don't worry, darling. This wedding will be the event of the season. Everyone who matters will be impressed. Edward mentioned his mother might cause problems, Vanessa continued, lowering her voice slightly. He says she was quite emotional about not being invited properly. Well, what did he expect? People like that don't understand our world. They take everything so personally. Mrs. Blackwell sighed dramatically. Thankfully, she seems to have accepted the situation. Edward says she stopped calling him altogether. Indeed, I hadn't called Edward since discovering his lies. What would be the point? Every conversation would be built on deception. His pretense that he respected me. My pretense that I didn't know how deeply he had betrayed me. Still, I'll feel better when the wedding is over and we've secured the house money, Vanessa said, checking something off on her clipboard. Edward says she's quite attached to that little place. It's hardly worth anything by our standards, but it should cover the down payment on something decent. I moved past them, invisible in my navy uniform, carrying my bucket of cleaning supplies. I was nothing to them, just the help, just people like that. And to Edward, I was just a resource to be tapped, an embarrassment to be hidden, a past to be erased. But I had not raised my son to be this person. Somewhere inside him, there must be a remnant of the boy I had loved so fiercely, who had once looked at me with adoration and respect. I just needed to find a way to reach that part of him before it was too late, before he sacrificed his integrity completely on the altar of social advancement. That night, Back in my own home, I sat at my kitchen table and wrote a letter to my son, pouring out decades of love, sacrifice, pride, and now, profound disappointment. I didn't know if I would ever give it to him, but the act of writing it helped clarify my thoughts, strengthened my resolve for what needed to be done. When Ida May called to check in, I told her what I had learned about the Blackwells. "So they're frauds," she said with a low whistle. "Playing at being aristocracy while drowning in debt. Can't say I'm surprised." "The worst part is that Edward doesn't seem to know," I replied. "He truly believes they're everything they pretend to be. He's trading his real mother for a fake family. What are you going to do now, Ellie? Still want to go through with the plan?" I thought about all I had seen and heard in the past 2 days. The casual cruelty, the lies, the manipulation. I thought about the son I had raised and the man he was becoming under the Blackwell's influence. "More than ever," I said firmly. "But with one change. I need to talk to an attorney first thing tomorrow." "An attorney?" Ida May sounded surprised. "What for?" "To protect what's mine," I replied, "and to make sure Edward understands exactly what he's throwing away." James Whitaker had been Robert's best friend since high school. When Robert died, James had helped me navigate the confusing world of insurance claims and funeral arrangements. He'd checked in on us regularly during those first difficult years, bringing casseroles and fixing leaky faucets until his job relocated him to Atlanta. Now a successful attorney specializing in estate planning, he'd always told me to call if I needed anything. I never had. Until now. "Ellie Thompson," he said warmly when I walked into his office the next morning. "It's been too long." His smile faded as he took in my expression. "What's wrong? Is it Edward?" For the next hour, I laid out everything. The wedding invitation addressed to house staff, the overheard conversations, the plans for my house, the misappropriated flower money. James listened without interruption, his face growing increasingly grave. "I'm so sorry, Ellie," he said when I finished. "I always thought Edward would grow into a man his father would be proud of." "So did I replied, my voice barely audible. "I don't know where I went wrong." "You didn't go wrong," James said firmly. "Edward made his own choices. But now we need to protect you." He leaned forward. "First, let's secure your home. I can draw up papers explicitly stating that you have no intention to sell your property, and that no one is authorized to act on your behalf regarding its sale or transfer." "Can Edward somehow force a sale?" I asked, fear creeping into my voice. "Not without your signature or power of attorney, which I'm guessing you've never granted him." I shook my head. "Good. Then legally, he can't touch your house. But we should still formally document your wishes. And I'd recommend changing your will, at least temporarily." My stomach clenched. "My will currently leaves everything to Edward." "I suspected as much," James said gently. "Given the circumstances, it might be prudent to amend that, at least until this situation resolves one way or another." I nodded slowly, the pain of this decision settling like a stone in my chest. I had never imagined a day when I wouldn't want to leave everything to my only child. But then, I had never imagined my only child would plan to profit from my exclusion, from his life. What about the money I already gave them? The $15,000 for flowers that's actually being used for Edward's wardrobe and their honeymoon? James's expression hardened. "That's fraud, Ellie. You gave money under false pretenses. We can demand its return, possibly even pursue legal action if necessary." "I don't want to sue my son," I said quickly. "Of course not. But we can send a formal letter requesting the return of funds, citing the misrepresentation. It establishes a paper trail and puts them on notice that you know what they've done." He studied me carefully. "What exactly do you want out of this, Ellie? What's your end goal?" I sat in silence for a long moment, considering his question. What did I want? Not revenge. Despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to wish ill on my own son. Not money. I had lived simply for decades and had enough for my needs. Not even recognition. It was far too late for the Blackwells to suddenly respect me. As Edward's mother, "I want my son back," I finally said, tears welling in my eyes. Not the social climbing doctor who's ashamed of me, but the boy who understood the value of honest work and genuine relationships. I want him to remember who he is and where he came from before he loses himself completely to that world. James nodded sympathetically. And if that's not possible? I wiped away my tears, my resolve strengthening. Then I want him to understand exactly what he's throwing away. Not just his mother, but his integrity, his authentic self. I raised him better than this, James. I know you did. He began making notes on a legal pad. Here's what we'll do. I'll draft the protective documents for your home immediately. We'll amend your will, temporarily, to create a small trust for Edward, but direct most of your estate to charities you care about. And I'll prepare a letter regarding the misappropriated funds. As I left James's office an hour later, I felt a strange combination of heartbreak and empowerment. For the first time since discovering Edward's betrayal, I was taking concrete steps to protect myself. But the necessity of those steps only underscored how broken our relationship had become. Driving home, I passed the small diner where Edward and I had celebrated special occasions throughout his childhood. On impulse, I pulled into the parking lot and went inside. Nothing had changed. The same red vinyl booths, the same faded menu boards, the same smell of coffee and homemade pie. "Miss Ellie," called Mabel, the owner who had watched Edward grow up over countless pancake breakfasts and celebratory milkshakes. "Haven't seen you in ages. How's that doctor's son of yours?" "Getting married this weekend," I replied, forcing a smile. "Well, isn't that wonderful? You must be so proud." Mabel beamed at me. "Are you ready for your mother of the groom dress and all that fancy business?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I opened my mouth to respond but found I couldn't speak past the lump in my throat. Mabel's smile faded, replaced by concern. "Honey, what's wrong?" "I'm not invited," I managed to whisper. "Edward doesn't want his colleagues to know his mother is a housekeeper." Mabel's kind face registered first confusion, then shock, then outrage. "Not invited? To your own son's wedding? The son you raised alone, working 3 jobs to put through school? That boy has lost his mind." Her indignation was somehow more painful than sympathy would have been. It validated the wrongness of what Edward had done, making it impossible to pretend this was normal or acceptable. "I'm sorry," I said, turning to leave. "I shouldn't have—" "You sit right down," Mabel ordered, steering me to a booth in the corner. "I'm bringing you pie and coffee, and you're going to tell me everything." And somehow, sitting in that familiar booth where I'd watched Edward grow from a toddler to a young man, the full weight of his betrayal finally crashed over me. I told Mabel everything, my voice breaking as I recounted each painful detail. "That boy," she kept saying, shaking her head in disbelief. "That foolish, foolish boy?" When I finished, Mabel reached across the table and squeezed my hands. "You listen to me, Ellie Thompson. You are worth 10 of those fancy Blackwells with their big house and their fake smiles. And one day, Edward is going to realize what he threw away." I nodded, too emotional to speak. "So what are you going to do?" she asked finally. I thought about James's legal protections, about the information I'd gathered at the Blackwell estate, about my dawning understanding of what Edward had become. "I'm going to show up at that wedding," I said, the words surprising me even as I spoke them. Not as the help, not skulking in the background where I won't embarrass anyone, as Edward's mother, the mother who raised him, who sacrificed everything, for him, who loves him enough to try one last time to save him from himself. Mabel's face broke into a broad smile. "Now that's the Ellie Thompson I know." "He'll be furious," I said, already imagining Edward's reaction. "He might never forgive me." "Maybe," Mabel acknowledged. but at least you'll have been true to yourself. And sometimes that's all we can do. As I drove home, I felt a strange sense of peace settling over me. The hurt was still there, would always be there, I suspected, but it was no longer paralyzing. In its place was a clear-eyed determination to face whatever came next with dignity and self-respect. Edward had forgotten who he was, but I hadn't forgotten who I was. A woman who had scrubbed other people's floors without shame, who had built a life from nothing, who had raised a son with love and sacrifice. If Edward was determined to erase that part of his history, that was his choice. But I would not participate in my own erasure. Not anymore. When I arrived home, there was a message waiting on my answering machine. Edward's voice, tense and irritated. "Mom, the florist just called me saying there's a problem with the payment. What's going on? I need you to call me back immediately." I smiled grimly as I deleted the message without returning the call. The first ripples of my quiet rebellion were already being felt, and the wedding was still 3 days away. The following morning, I returned to the Blackwell estate with a new sense of purpose. I was no longer just observing. I was gathering information, not merely to protect myself, but to understand exactly what kind of world Edward was so desperate to join. Mrs. Blackwell barely acknowledged me as she rushed through the grand foyer, barking orders into her phone about table settings and champagne selections. I kept my head down, moving efficiently through the guest bedrooms with my cleaning cart, appearing to be nothing more than a diligent housekeeper. In reality, I was methodically documenting the truth behind the Blackwells' carefully cultivated facade. The wedding guests had begun to arrive, staying in the estate's numerous guest rooms. While cleaning the room of Mr. Blackwell's business partner, I discovered bank statements carelessly left on the desk, revealing substantial loans made to Blackwell Enterprises that appeared to be in default. In another guest room, I overheard a hushed phone conversation between Mrs. Blackwell's sister and her husband, discussing how the family was leveraging Edward's hospital connections to salvage their failing medical supply business. "The boy has no idea they're using him," the woman had whispered. "Victoria and Charles are presenting it as a favor to their new son-in-law, but they're desperate for those hospital contracts." Each discovery confirmed what I had begun to suspect. The Blackwells weren't welcoming Edward into their prestigious world. They were exploiting his medical credentials and connections to shore up their crumbling empire. And my son, so blinded by his desire to belong, couldn't see that he was being used. I was arranging fresh towels in the bathroom of the East Wing guest suite when I heard Edward's voice in the adjoining room. He sounded agitated. "I've called her 5 times, Vanessa. She's not answering." "Well, figure it out," Vanessa snapped. "The florist is threatening to pull out without the final payment, and Daddy refuses to cover it. He says we've already exceeded the budget by $30,000. I don't understand what happened. She promised me that money. She's never gone back on her word before." "Maybe she finally grew a spine," Vanessa said coldly. "Not that it matters why. What matters is fixing this problem before it ruins everything. Can't you just get the money somewhere else? What about a cash advance on your credit card?" "I'm already maxed out from the engagement ring and the honeymoon deposits," Edward admitted, his voice tight with embarrassment. "The residency salary doesn't go far, and I won't get the real attending physician pay until next month." There was a heavy sigh from Vanessa. "This is exactly why we need your mother's house money, Edward. We can't keep living like this, scraping by on promises and credit cards. The down payment on the Riverside house is due 3 weeks after the wedding." I know. I'll figure something out. Maybe I can still convince her about the flowers." "You'd better." Vanessa's voice turned threatening. "Because if anything goes wrong with this wedding, my father will reconsider his support for your hospital board position. He's already taking a risk vouching for someone with your background." I stood frozen in the bathroom, bath mat still in hand, as the full reality of Edward's situation became clear. He wasn't just ashamed of me. He was financially desperate. The life he was trying to build with Vanessa was a house of cards, dependent on loans, credit, and the goodwill of the Blackwells. And now he was counting on selling my house to maintain the illusion of prosperity. I quietly finished my work and slipped out of the room before they could discover my presence. As I pushed my cart down the hall, I spotted Marjorie, the Blackwells' personal assistant, hurrying toward me with a worried expression. "Mrs. Thompson, there you are. Dr. Edward has been looking everywhere for you. He doesn't know you're working here, does he?" I shook my head. "No, and I'd prefer to keep it that way, at least for now." She nodded in understanding. "He's asked me to track down his mother's contact information. Apparently there's some issue with the flowers." She lowered her voice. "Mrs. Blackwell is furious. She's saying if the flowers aren't resolved by tomorrow, they'll have to use artificial arrangements, and it will ruin the Southern Living photo shoot." "That would be terrible," I replied, not bothering to hide the sarcasm in my tone. Marjorie's lips twitched in a suppressed smile. "By the way, I have something that might interest you. I was organizing Mr. Blackwell's files, and I found this." She handed me a folder. "It's the financial background check they ran on Edward before allowing the engagement to proceed. I thought you should see how they really view your son." I thanked her and tucked the folder into my cleaning supplies. Later, during my lunch break, I sat in my car and read through the documents. The Blackwells had investigated every aspect of Edward's life: his education, his financial situation, his professional prospects, and yes, his family background. The report clinically detailed my occupation, my modest home, my lack of social connections or prestigious education. It concluded with a recommendation that, despite the candidate's humble origins, his medical career and professional trajectory make him an acceptable match, provided the family connection is minimized in social settings. They had evaluated my son like a commodity, assessing his value against his perceived deficits. And his greatest deficit, according to their calculation, was me. I returned the folder to my cleaning cart and continued my work, moving through the house like a ghost. I polished the silver that would be used at my son's wedding dinner, straightened the guest linens where his new in-laws would sleep, and swept the grand staircase he would descend as a married man. All the while, a plan was forming in my mind. Not a plan for revenge, but for truth. When my shift ended, I met Ida May in the staff parking area behind the estate. "How did it go today?" she asked, studying my face with concern. "Illuminating," I replied. "I've learned exactly what kind of people the Blackwells are, and exactly what kind of trouble Edward is in." I filled her in on everything I'd discovered: the financial problems, the planned exploitation of Edward's medical connections, the background check, the desperate search for my flower money. Ida May listened intently, her expression growing increasingly troubled. "So they're not just snobs," she concluded. "They're manipulative snobs on the verge of financial collapse. And they see Edward as their salvation," I added. "His medical career, his hospital connections, that's what they're really after. The irony is that Edward thinks he's the one benefiting from their social status. And meanwhile, he's throwing you under the bus and trying to sell your house out from under." "You?" Ida May shook her head in disgust. "What are you going to do with all this information, Ellie?" I considered the question carefully. I could expose the Blackwells' financial troubles, reveal their manipulation of Edward, even confront my son with evidence of their true motivations. But would any of that actually help? Or would it just drive Edward further into their arms, determined to prove his loyalty to his new family? "I'm still working that out," I admitted. "But whatever I do, it needs to accomplish two things: protect me and my home, and give Edward a chance to remember who he really is before it's too late." Ida May squeezed my shoulder. "You're a better mother than he deserves right now." "Maybe," I said softly. "But I'm the only mother he has. And I won't give up on him just because he's given up on me." As I drove home that evening, my phone rang again. Edward, for the 6th time that day. This time, I answered, Mom, finally. Relief and irritation mingled in his voice. Where have you been? I've been calling for days. I've been busy, I replied calmly. Working. Well, there's a problem with the flowers. The florist says they haven't received the final payment, and they're threatening to cancel the entire order. I thought you took care of this. I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. I was under the impression my contribution was for flowers, Edward. But I've since learned it's actually for your new wardrobe and a honeymoon upgrade. Did you think I wouldn't find out? There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. Then, who told you that? Does it matter? Is it true? Another long pause. Mom, you don't understand. There were last-minute changes to the budget. Adjustments that had to be made. The flowers are still being taken care of, just differently. Just like my presence at your wedding is being taken care of differently? I asked, my voice steady despite the pain behind the words. By pretending I don't exist? Mom, we've been through this. It's complicated. No, Edward, it's actually very simple. You're ashamed of me. Of the work I've done all my life to support you. Work that put you through medical school that gave you every opportunity I never had. That's not fair, he protested. I'm grateful for everything you've done. Grateful enough to introduce me as your mother to your new family? Grateful enough to have me sit in the front row at your wedding instead of watching from the staff. Area, if I'm lucky enough to be allowed that? His silence was answer enough. I need to go, I said finally. I have an early morning tomorrow. Wait, Edward said quickly. What about the flowers? We need that money, Mom. The wedding is in 2 days. I closed my eyes, feeling a mixture of disappointment and resolve. I guess you'll have to figure something out, Edward. Just like I always did when times were tough. I hung up before he could respond, my hands trembling slightly as I set the phone down. For the first time in his life, I had denied Edward something he wanted. It felt terrible and necessary all at once. Tomorrow would be my last day working at the Blackwell estate before the wedding. And I had one more critical piece of information to uncover. The day before the wedding, the Blackwell estate was in a state of controlled chaos. Staff rushed through the hallways with flower arrangements, caterers tested final menu items in the kitchen, and a team of decorators transformed the grand ballroom into a fairy tale setting. Amidst this whirlwind, I moved like a shadow, focusing on my assigned tasks while keeping my ears open. Have you heard the latest crisis? Whispered one of the regular housekeepers as we crossed paths in the linen closet. The florist delivered half the order this morning but refuses to bring the rest until they're paid. Mrs. Blackwell is beside herself. I nodded sympathetically, but said nothing. The stopped payment on my check had created exactly the disruption I'd anticipated. Shortly before noon, I was dusting the antique sideboard in the formal dining room when Mrs. Blackwell stormed in, followed by Vanessa and Edward. None of them noticed me in the corner as they huddled at the far end of the massive table. This is absolutely unacceptable, Mrs. Blackwell hissed. Southern Living will be here at 3 to photograph the setup, and we have half the flowers we need. What did your mother say, Edward? Edward looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes. She knows the money wasn't for flowers. Someone told her about the budget reallocation. Who would? Mrs. Blackwell began, then waved her hand dismissively. It doesn't matter. What matters is fixing this. Charles refuses to advance anymore. Money. He says we're already $30,000 over budget. I could ask Dr. Harrington for an advance on my first paycheck, Edward suggested, his voice hollow. Vanessa shook her head sharply. Absolutely not. We can't show any financial weakness to your new colleagues. It would undermine everything we've worked for. Then what do you suggest? Edward asked, frustration evident in his tone. The florist won't budge without payment. Blackwell tapped her manicured nails on the polished mahogany. What about the house? Your mother's property. Could we get a bridge loan against the expected sale? I froze, duster in hand, holding my breath. Edward's response was quieter, forcing me to strain to hear. I spoke to a real estate agent. He says we'd need my mother's signature on any listing agreement or loan application. She hasn't returned my calls since yesterday. This is absurd, Vanessa snapped. Your mother has manipulated this situation. Perfectly. She's ruining our wedding out of spite. It's not spite, Edward said, a hint of the sun I knew finally showing through. She's hurt. I should have been honest with her from the beginning. Oh, please. Vanessa rolled her eyes. She cleans toilets for a living, Edward. She should be grateful you've done as well as you have, not making demands about wedding invitations and flowers. I watched my son's face, hoping to see outrage at this insult to his mother. Instead, he simply looked defeated. Let's focus on solving the flower problem, Mrs. Blackwell interjected. I refuse to have artificial arrangements in those southern, living photographs. She turned to Edward, her voice suddenly honeyed. Darling, I know this is difficult, but could you try one more time with your mother? Perhaps if you visited her in person? Play on her maternal feelings? She's not answering her door either, Edward admitted. I went by this morning. Of course. I hadn't answered. I'd been here, cleaning their home while they plotted to take mine. Mrs. Blackwell pursed her lips. Then we need another solution. I'll call Richardson's and see if they can redirect some arrangements from the governor's dinner. Tonight. Claim a mix-up in delivery dates. She stood, smoothing her silk blouse. And Edward, do keep trying your mother. The house situation will need to be addressed immediately after the wedding. The Riverside property won't wait forever. They swept, out of the dining room, still not noticing me in the corner. I released the breath I'd been holding and carefully placed the duster in my cart. This had been my last scheduled shift at the Blackwell estate. I had gathered all the information I needed. Back at home that afternoon, I spread my findings across my kitchen table. Photos I'd discreetly taken of financial documents, notes I'd made of overheard conversations, the background check Marjorie had given me. The picture they painted was clear. The Blackwells were desperate for Edward's medical connections to save their failing businesses, while Edward and Vanessa were counting on my house to finance their new life of pretend prosperity. I picked up the phone and called James. Are the legal protections for my home in place? I asked when he answered. Filed and recorded this morning, he confirmed. No one can sell that property without your explicit consent. And the letter about the misappropriated funds? Delivered to both Edward and the Blackwells via certified mail this morning. They should have received it by now. I nodded, though he couldn't see me. Good. And the changes to my will? Also complete. The trust for Edward is established but limited. The majority will go to the Educational Foundation for Single Parents, as we discussed. Is there something else you need, Ellie? I hesitated, then asked the question that had been weighing on me. Is what I'm planning to do tomorrow? Is it wrong? James, should I just let Edward go his own way, even if I believe he's making a terrible mistake? James was quiet for a moment. When Robert died, he finally said, he made me promise to look after both of you. Over the years, I've watched you sacrifice everything for Edward. But the greatest gift you ever gave him wasn't the money or the education or the opportunities. It was your example of integrity and hard work. He seems to have forgotten that. Example? I said softly. Maybe. Or maybe he's lost his way temporarily. Either way, I think you owe it to both of you to make one last stand for the truth. After that, whatever happens is up to Edward. I thanked him and hung up, feeling both nervous and strangely calm. The path forward was clear now. Not easy, but clear. Next, I called Ida May. Everything's arranged, she assured me before I could even ask. The car will pick you up at 10 tomorrow morning. And I've spoken to Mabel. She and the others will be ready. Are you sure they want to be involved? I asked. This could get uncomfortable. Ida May laughed. Honey, They're fighting over who gets to come. Mabel says she's been waiting 30 years to see you finally stand up for yourself. We're all behind you 100%. I smiled, touched by the support of friends I hadn't fully appreciated until now. Thank you, Ida May. For everything. Just doing what friends do, she replied warmly. Now, about that dress we talked about. I picked it up from the boutique this afternoon, I confirmed. It's perfect. After saying goodbye, I went to my bedroom closet and removed the garment bag I'd brought home earlier. Inside was not the modest pale blue dress I'd originally purchased for the wedding, but something entirely different, a designer suit in deep burgundy that Ida May had helped me select. It had cost more than I'd ever spent on clothing for myself, but as Ida May had insisted, if you're going to crash your son's wedding, you might as well look spectacular doing it. I laid the suit carefully across my bed, alongside the pearl earrings I'd once planned to give Vanessa. Tomorrow they would adorn my ears instead, a small symbol of reclaiming what was mine. The final call I made that evening was to Marjorie at the Blackwell estate. Is everything set for tomorrow? I asked, when she answered. Just as you requested, she confirmed in a low voice. I've arranged for you to be added to the guest list under my authority. Security has your name, and I've marked you as a special family guest with access to all areas. No one checks these details too closely on the day. They're too busy managing the main event. And the seating? I've added a place for you at table 1. Front row, right where the mother of the groom should be. There was satisfaction in her voice. The Blackwells are too distracted by the flower crisis to notice the change. Thank you, Marjorie. I know this is a risk for you. Let's just say, I've worked for the Blackwells long enough to enjoy seeing someone finally stand up to them, she replied. Besides, I gave my notice yesterday. After hearing how they talk about the staff behind closed doors, I couldn't stomach it anymore. After we hung up, I sat in my quiet kitchen, looking around at the home Robert and I had made together, the home where I'd raised Edward. Every scratch on the wooden table, every worn spot on the linoleum floor told a story of our life together. This was the inheritance I wanted to leave my son, not just property or money, but a legacy of authenticity and dignity. Tomorrow would determine whether he could still claim that inheritance or whether he had traded it permanently for the hollow privilege the Blackwells offered. I went to bed early that night, knowing I would need all my strength for what lay ahead. As I drifted off to sleep, I found myself remembering Edward as a small boy, proudly showing me a drawing he'd made of the two of us, stick figures holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun. That's you and me, Mom, he'd explained solemnly. Together forever. Tomorrow would test whether anything of that little boy remained in the man who was ashamed to call me mother. The morning of Edward's wedding dawned clear and bright, as if the weather itself was determined to create the perfect backdrop for the Blackwells' carefully orchestrated spectacle. I woke early, a strange calm having settled over me during the night. Whatever happened today, I would face it with dignity and truth, the values I had tried to instill in my son throughout his life. I was sipping my first cup of coffee when my doorbell rang. When I opened the door, I was shocked to find Edward standing on my porch, still in yesterday's rumpled clothes, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept. "Mom," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside, allowing him to enter the home he'd grown up in but hadn't visited in months. He walked into the living room and stood awkwardly, looking around as if seeing it for the first time. "Would you like some coffee?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. He nodded gratefully, and I busied myself in the kitchen, giving us both a moment to prepare for the conversation ahead. When I returned with his mug, cream, no, sugar, just as he'd always taken it, he was staring at the family photos on the mantel. Photos that spanned his entire life, from infancy to medical school graduation. "I've been up all night," he said, accepting the coffee. driving around, thinking. I sat in my usual armchair, waiting silently for him to continue. We received a letter yesterday, he finally said, from a lawyer about the flower money and other things. James Whitaker, I supplied. Your father's old friend. Edward nodded. It said you know about the budget reallocation and about the house. I know everything, Edward. About the Blackwells' financial troubles, about how they're planning to use your medical connections to save their businesses, about the background check they ran on you that classified me as a liability to be minimized. I kept my voice even, stating facts rather than accusations. He flinched visibly. How did you— I've been working at the Blackwell estate all week, I interrupted. Cleaning their rooms, polishing their silver, preparing their home for the wedding I wasn't deemed worthy to attend as your mother. Edward sank onto the sofa, looking stricken. You were there? All week? Johnson Estate Services, I confirmed. Ida May's company. We've become partners. So you heard. He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Everything, I said quietly. Every dismissive comment. Every lie, every plan to exploit my home and my money. I heard Vanessa say I clean toilets for a living and that you should be grateful I don't make demands. I heard Mrs. Blackwell suggest you play on my maternal feelings to get the flower money. And yes, I heard about the plans for my house. Set his coffee down, his hands trembling slightly. Mom, I can explain. Can you? I asked, genuinely curious what possible explanation could justify such betrayal. Edward ran a hand through his disheveled hair. It all happened so gradually. When I first met Vanessa, I was just a resident. Her world was so different from anything I'd known. The parties, the connections, the opportunities. But her parents were skeptical about me. Because of your humble origins, I quoted from the background check. He winced, but nodded. I wanted to prove I belonged, that I was good enough for their daughter. So I started adapting, changing little things about myself, my history, including your mother. It wasn't like that at first, he insisted. I was proud of you, of how hard you'd worked to give me opportunities. But then there was a dinner party where Mrs. Blackwell asked what my parents did, and when I said my father had died young and my mother was a housekeeper. Let me guess, I said dryly. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. Something like that, he admitted. After that, Vanessa suggested that maybe it would be easier to say, you managed household staff for wealthy families. It seemed harmless at the time, just a small adjustment to the truth to make things smoother. And then one small adjustment led to another, and another, I observed. Until eventually you were telling them I couldn't attend your wedding because I wouldn't fit in. Edward looked down at his hands. I'm so sorry, Mom. I got caught up in their world, in trying to be what they wanted. Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what really matters. His apology sounded sincere, and a small part of me wanted desperately to believe him, to embrace my son and forgive everything. But something held me back. Perhaps the memory of his voice saying, my mother understands her place. Why are you here, Edward? I asked directly. Is it because you're genuinely sorry or because you need the flower money to salvage the wedding? He flinched as if I'd slapped him. That's not fair. Isn't it? You haven't visited in months. You addressed my wedding invitation to house staff. You planned to sell my home without my knowledge, and now, hours before your wedding, when the flowers are half delivered and Southern Living is coming to photograph everything, suddenly you're on my doorstep with an apology. It's not like that, he protested, but the flush creeping up his neck told me I'd hit the mark. Tell me honestly, I pressed. If the florist had been paid in full, would you be here right now? His silence was answer enough. I thought so. I said softly, disappointment weighing heavy in my chest. You don't want reconciliation, Edward. You want a checkbook. He stood abruptly, anger flashing in his eyes. Fine. Yes, we need the money. The flowers are a disaster, and Vanessa is beside herself. But that doesn't mean I'm not also sorry about how things have gone between us. And after the wedding? I asked. Will you still be sorry then? Sorry enough to acknowledge me as your mother to your new family and colleagues? Sorry enough to stop planning to sell my home out from under me? Edward paced the small living room, conflict evident on his face. It's complicated, Mom. The Blackwells have certain expectations. They've invested a lot in this wedding, in my future with their daughter. I can't just throw that away. Even if what they're investing in isn't the real you, even if they're primarily interested in using your medical credentials to salvage their failing businesses? He stopped pacing, staring at me in disbelief. What are you talking about? Blackwell Enterprises is on the verge of bankruptcy, I explained. Their medical supply company is losing contracts to competitors. They're counting on your hospital connections to turn things around. Did you know that? That's ridiculous, he said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. Mr. Blackwell is one of the most successful businessmen in Charleston. He was, I corrected. Now he's leveraged to the hilt and desperate for a lifeline. Why do you think they're so focused on impressing the hospital board members at your wedding? It's not about your career, Edward. It's about saving theirs. Edward sank back onto the sofa, absorbing this unwelcome information. I could see him mentally reviewing interactions with the Blackwells, reevaluating conversations and proposals in light of this new perspective. Even if that's true, he finally said, I love Vanessa. I want to marry her. Are you sure? I asked gently. Or do you love who you pretend to be when you're with her? The Edward who's ashamed of his mother and his background? The Edward who's willing to lie and manipulate to maintain appearances? He had no answer for that. We sat in silence for several long minutes, the ticking of the clock on the mantel the only sound in the room. Finally, Edward stood. I need to go. The wedding is in a few hours, and there's still the flower situation to resolve. I nodded, also rising. Of course. He hesitated at the door, turning back to me with pleading eyes. Mom, about the flowers. Despite everything, my heart ached at the desperation in his face. It would be so easy to write another check, to fall back into the pattern of sacrificing everything to make Edward's path easier. But that pattern had led us here, to this broken relationship where my value to my son was measured only in what I could provide. I'm sorry, Edward, I said firmly. I won't be financing any more deceptions. His face hardened. Fine. We'll manage without your help, as usual. The unfairness of that statement was breathtaking. Without my help? I echoed incredulously. Everything you are, everything you have, is because of my help. My work, my sacrifice, my support. But apparently, that only counts when it comes with a checkbook attached. That's not what I meant. He backpedaled quickly. The wedding is so important. It's my future. So is your integrity, I replied. And your relationship with your mother. But you've made your priorities clear. He left without another word, the door closing behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded like an ending. I stood in my quiet living room, surrounded by the photographs that chronicled our life together, and allowed myself a moment of grief for the relationship that had once been. Then I brushed away my tears and went to prepare for the wedding. I had a different kind of statement to make today, not with a checkbook, but with my presence. The car Ida May had arranged, a sleek black town car with tinted windows, arrived precisely at 10. The driver, a dignified older gentleman in a crisp uniform, tipped his hat respectfully as he opened the door for me. Mrs. Thompson, he greeted me. I'm Harold. Miss Ida May asked me to ensure you arrive in style today. I smoothed the front of my burgundy suit, feeling both nervous and strangely powerful. The fabric was finer than anything I'd ever worn, the tailoring perfect for my frame, making me look taller and more elegant than I'd felt in years. The pearl earrings gleamed at my ears, and I'd taken special care with my makeup and hair, which was swept up in a sophisticated twist. "Thank you, Harold," I replied, sliding into the back seat. "I appreciate your assistance." As we drove to the Blackwell estate, I mentally reviewed my plan. Marjorie had assured me I was on the guest list, with a seat at the family table. James had confirmed that his legal protections for my home were securely in place. Ida May and my other friends would be arriving separately, ready to support me if needed. All the pieces were in position, yet I still wasn't entirely sure what would happen when Edward saw me at his wedding, the mother he had tried so hard to erase. Would he publicly reject me? Embrace me? Pretend not to know me? And what about Vanessa and the Blackwells? How would they react to the housekeeper they had so casually dismissed suddenly appearing as a guest at their carefully curated event? 20 minutes later, Harold pulled up to the imposing gates of the Blackwell estate. Security guards checked his credentials and consulted their tablets before waving us through. So far, so good. "I'll be parked in the VIP section, Mrs. Thompson," Harold informed me as we approached the grand circular driveway. "Miss Ida May instructed me to remain available to you throughout the day, whatever you might need." I thanked him, touched by Ida May's thoughtfulness. As I stepped out of the car, I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and mentally adopted the quiet authority I had observed in women like Mrs. Blackwell. The confidence that came from knowing your place in the world and refusing to apologize for it. The front entrance of the mansion had been transformed with an archway of white roses and delicate greenery. A young woman in a pale blue dress stood at a reception table, checking invitations and directing guests. "Good morning," I said, approaching her with a warm smile. "Eleanor Thompson, mother of the groom." She scanned her tablet, her eyes widening slightly when she found my name. "Yes, Mrs. Thompson. You're seated at table 1, with the immediate family. The ceremony will begin in the Rose Garden at 11, followed by a reception in the grand ballroom." She handed me an elegant program, printed on heavy cream paper, tied with a silver ribbon. "Welcome to the Blackwell-Thompson wedding." I thanked her and moved into the grand foyer, now filled with well-dressed guests mingling and admiring the elaborate flower arrangements that adorned every surface. Despite the half-delivery crisis I had overheard yesterday, it appeared the Blackwells had managed to find a solution. I wondered briefly what strings had been pulled or whose budget had been raided to make it happen. No one gave me a second glance as I moved through the crowd. In my designer suit and pearls, I looked like I belonged, just another affluent wedding guest among many. How different from the invisibility I had experienced in my Navy uniform just days before. The same people who had walked past me without a glance while I dusted their surroundings now nodded politely as I passed. I made my way to the Rose Garden, where rows of white chairs had been arranged before an elaborate floral arch. A string quartet played softly near the front, and ushers in formal attire guided guests to their seats. Following the direction on my program, I moved toward the front section, reserved for family. Mrs. Blackwell was already there, resplendent in a lavender silk dress and an elaborate hat, directing the photographer and fussing over flower placements. She hadn't noticed me yet, focused as she was on ensuring everything was perfect for the Southern Living photo shoot. I chose a moment when she was relatively alone to approach her. "Mrs. Blackwell," I said, extending my hand, "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. I'm Eleanor Thompson, Edward's mother." The color drained from her face, then quickly returned in splotches of angry red. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice low but sharp. There must be some mistake. "No mistake," I replied calmly. "I'm on the guest list. Table 1, I believe." "That's impossible," Edward assured us. She stopped herself, glancing around to ensure no one was witnessing our exchange. "This is highly irregular. Edward specifically said you wouldn't be attending." "Plans change," I said with a polite smile. "I wouldn't miss my only son's wedding for the world." Her eyes narrowed dangerously. "I don't know how you managed to get on the guest list, but this is unacceptable. Do you have any idea how important this day is? The Anderson family from the hospital board is here, the governor's wife, the editor of Southern Living, people of influence and standing. This wedding is about creating the right impression." "And what impression would that be?" I asked, still maintaining my pleasant tone. "That my son is ashamed of his mother? That he's willing to deny his own family to gain social approval?" Mrs. Blackwell's perfectly made-up face twisted in barely concealed contempt. "Your son has worked very hard to rise above his circumstances. Surely you wouldn't want to undermine that progress with your presence." The naked disdain in her voice might have wounded me a week ago. Now it merely confirmed everything I had learned about the Blackwells. "My son rose above his circumstances because I worked 3 jobs to put him through school," I replied, my voice still pleasant but firm. "Because I sacrificed everything to give him opportunities I never had. I'm not here to undermine Edward. I'm here to celebrate the remarkable young man I raised. A doctor, a healer, someone who helps others regardless of their social standing. At least, that's the son I thought I raised." Before Mrs. Blackwell could respond, Vanessa appeared, stunning, in her pre-ceremony outfit, clearly on her way to the bridal suite for final preparations. "Mother, the florist needs your approval on the—" She stopped abruptly when she saw me, her perfect features freezing in shock. "Mrs. Thompson, what are you doing here?" "Hello, Vanessa," I said. "I've come to attend my son's wedding, but you're not supposed to." She caught herself, forcing a brittle smile. "I mean, we were under the impression you couldn't make it." "I wouldn't miss it," I assured her. "After all, it's not every day your only child gets married." Mrs. Blackwell placed a protective arm around her daughter. "Vanessa, darling, why don't you finish getting ready? I'll handle this situation." Vanessa hesitated, clearly torn between escaping the awkward encounter and staying to ensure I was properly dealt with. "Should I tell Edward?" "No." Her mother replied firmly. "The groom shouldn't be troubled with logistical issues on his wedding day. I'll take care of everything." After Vanessa reluctantly departed, Mrs. Blackwell turned back to me, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "Now, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I won't allow you to disrupt this wedding. My husband has considerable influence in this community. One word from him could make life very difficult for someone in your profession." I met her gaze steadily. "Are you threatening me, Mrs. Blackwell?" "I'm merely pointing out realities," she replied. "Now, I think it would be best if you quietly excused yourself. Tell the ushers there was a mix-up with the invitation. We can arrange for you to view the ceremony from a distance if you insist on staying, but you cannot be seated with the family. It would raise too many questions." I smiled, a genuine smile this time, because her desperate attempt to maintain control only confirmed how powerless she actually was. "I understand your concern, but I'm afraid I must decline your suggestion. My name is on the guest list. My place card is at table 1, and I have every intention of witnessing my son's wedding from the seat reserved for the mother of the groom." Mrs. Blackwell's eyes narrowed to slits. "Security!" she called sharply, beckoning to one of the uniformed men standing discreetly at the garden entrance. As the guard approached, I noticed Marjorie hurrying toward us, clipboard in hand, her expression professionally neutral despite the tension she was walking into. "Is there a problem, Mrs. Blackwell?" she asked. "Yes," Mrs. Blackwell snapped. "This woman is attempting to insert herself into the family seating. She claims to be on the guest list, which is clearly an error." Marjorie consulted her clipboard with exaggerated thoroughness. "Mrs. Eleanor Thompson?" "Yes," She's listed here as a VIP guest, family section, table 1. She showed the clipboard to the security guard. Everything appears to be in order. Mrs. Blackwell's face contorted with fury. This is impossible. I approved the final guest list myself. Actually, Mr. Blackwell made some last-minute additions yesterday, Marjorie replied smoothly. It's all properly documented. The security guard, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, looked from Marjorie to Mrs. Blackwell. Ma'am? Your instructions? Mrs. Blackwell stood frozen in indecision, trapped by her own carefully constructed social rules. Making a scene would draw exactly the kind of attention she was desperate to avoid, particularly with the Southern Living photographer already capturing candid moments around the garden. This isn't over, she finally said to me, her voice barely audible. Then, to the guard and Marjorie, carry on. As she stalked away, Marjorie shot me a quick conspiratorial smile before returning to her duties. The first hurdle had been cleared, but the greater challenge still lay ahead. The moment when Edward would see me seated in the front row of his wedding, the mother he had tried to erase suddenly visible to everyone. I took my assigned seat, feeling the weight of curious glances from nearby guests who had witnessed some portion of the exchange with Mrs. Blackwell. Let them wonder. Soon enough, the truth would be unavoidable, not just for them, but for my son. As the garden filled with guests and the string quartet transitioned to the pre-ceremony music, I sat calmly in my front row seat, hands folded in my lap. Around me, the other chairs in the family section began to fill. Distant Blackwell relatives, a few of Edward's medical school friends who had been deemed socially acceptable, an elderly gentleman introduced as Vanessa's godfather. Each newcomer to our row glanced at me with polite curiosity, clearly wondering who I was, but too well-mannered to ask directly. Across the aisle, I spotted Ida May entering with Mabel from the diner and 2 other friends from my neighborhood, all dressed in their Sunday best. They had been invited as my personal guests, a detail Marjorie had added to the arrangements. Ida May caught my eye and gave me a subtle thumbs up, which I acknowledged with a small nod. Their presence fortified me, reminding me that I wasn't alone in this moment of confrontation. A flurry of activity near the garden entrance signaled the arrival of more important guests. Mr. Blackwell, distinguished in his tuxedo, was escorting what appeared to be the governor's wife to her seat. As they passed our row, his eyes landed on me, narrowed in confusion, then widened in recognition. He faltered mid-sentence, nearly stumbling on the white runner that formed the aisle. Mrs. Blackwell appeared at his side almost instantly, whispering urgently in his ear. His face darkened and he shot me a look that would have withered a lesser woman. I responded with a pleasant smile, as if we were old acquaintances greeting each other at a social function. The disruption was minor, but I noticed several guests watching the exchange with interest. The Blackwells' carefully constructed facade was already showing cracks, and the ceremony hadn't even begun. A few minutes later, as the music shifted to signal the approaching start of the ceremony, a young usher appeared at my side. "Mrs. Thompson?" he whispered. "Mr. Blackwell would like a word with you, privately." "How kind," I replied at normal volume. "But the ceremony is about to begin. Please tell him I'd be delighted to speak with him at the reception." The usher looked uncomfortable. "He was quite insistent, ma'am." "I'm sure he was," I acknowledged, with a sympathetic smile. "But I wouldn't miss my son's entrance for the world. Family obligation, you understand." My emphasis on family was deliberate and not lost on the nearby guests, who were now openly watching our exchange. The usher, realizing he was creating exactly the kind of scene the Blackwells had hoped to avoid, retreated with a brief nod. Then, the side door to the garden opened, and Edward emerged with the officiant and groomsmen. He looked handsome in his tuxedo, but tense, his eyes scanning the assembled guests. I knew the exact moment he saw me. His step faltered, and his face drained of color. For a long moment, we locked eyes across the garden. I didn't smile, didn't wave, didn't make any gesture that might humiliate him further. I simply held his gaze steadily, allowing him to see the mother he had tried to erase, now sitting exactly where she belonged. Edward's best man, noticing his distress, whispered something in his ear. Edward nodded mechanically and continued to his position at the altar, though his eyes kept darting back to me, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. The music swelled, signaling the start of the processional. The bridesmaids began, their graceful walk down the aisle, followed by the flower girl scattering rose petals. Finally, the string quartet transitioned to the bridal march, and everyone stood as Vanessa appeared on her father's arm, resplendent in her designer gown. She was genuinely beautiful in that moment, her face glowing with the special radiance of a bride. But as they processed down the aisle and past where I stood, her eyes met mine briefly, and her smile faltered. Mr. Blackwell's arm tightened around his daughter's. His jaw clenched as he deliberately avoided looking in my direction. When they reached the altar, Mr. Blackwell placed Vanessa's hand in Edward's with a formal gesture, then took his seat beside his wife in the front row opposite me. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone watching. On one side of the aisle, the Blackwells with their wealth and social connections. On the other, me, the mother Edward had tried to hide. The officiant began the ceremony, speaking of love and commitment, of two lives joining together. Edward seemed to regain his composure somewhat, focusing on Vanessa and the words being spoken. But twice during the readings, I caught him glancing in my direction, his expression unreadable. When the time came, for the exchange of vows, Edward's voice was steady as he promised to love and cherish Vanessa for all the days of his life. Vanessa, in turn, recited her vows clearly, though her eyes darted nervously toward me once, as if she expected me to object at any moment. But I remained silent and dignified, my presence alone making the statement I had come to make. I was Edward's. Mother had raised him, loved him, sacrificed for him. No amount of social climbing or reinvention could erase that fundamental truth. After the rings were exchanged and the pronouncement made, the new couple turned to face their guests as the officiant introduced Dr. and Mrs. Edward Thompson. They proceeded back down the aisle, Edward studiously avoiding eye contact with me as they passed. As the guests began to rise and move toward the cocktail reception area, Mrs. Blackwell made a beeline for me, her husband at her side. "I don't know how you managed to insert yourself into this ceremony," she hissed, keeping her voice low. "But this charade ends now. You will not attend the reception." "My invitation includes the reception," I replied calmly. "Table 1, as I mentioned." Mr. Blackwell stepped closer, his voice a controlled rumble. "Mrs. Thompson, let's be reasonable. Your presence here is causing Edward distress on what should be the happiest day of his life. Surely, as his mother, you wouldn't want that." "As his mother," I replied, emphasizing the relationship they had tried so hard to minimize, "I want him to live an authentic life, grounded in truth and integrity. The distress you're seeing isn't caused by my presence. It's caused by the lies he's been telling, to you, to Vanessa, perhaps even to himself." "This is preposterous," Mrs. Blackwell snapped, her composure slipping. "You're nothing but a housekeeper, trying to overreach her position." Several nearby guests slowed their departure, obviously intrigued by the developing confrontation. Among them was an elegant woman I recognized from photographs as the editor of Southern Living, her professional interest clearly piqued by the unexpected drama. "Victoria," Mr. Blackwell warned, noticing the audience they were attracting. "Not here." But Mrs. Blackwell was too angry to heed his caution. "You should have stayed where you belong, in the staff area, if anywhere. Do you have any idea how much planning went into creating the right impression today? The connections being formed? And now you've made a spectacle of yourself." I smiled, genuinely amused by her lack of self-awareness. "I'm not the one making a spectacle, Mrs. Blackwell. I'm simply a mother attending her son's wedding. You're the one causing a scene." She opened her mouth to retort, but at that moment, Ida May and my other friends approached, effectively creating a protective circle around me. "Is there a problem here?" Ida May asked, her voice pleasant but with a steel undertone. Mrs. Blackwell looked at the group with barely disguised disdain. "And who might you be?" "Ida May Johnson, President and CEO of Johnson Estate Services," she replied smoothly, extending a business card with a practiced motion. "We manage staff for many of Charleston's finest homes. You might recognize our uniforms. Your new seasonal staff this week came from my company." Mrs. Blackwell's eyes widened as the implication sank. You," she sputtered, looking back at me. You were one of the cleaning staff?" "Indeed," I confirmed. "I've spent the week preparing your home for this lovely wedding, polishing the silver, arranging the guest rooms, listening to conversations about how I wasn't good enough to attend my own son's wedding." The Southern Living editor had moved close enough to overhear the exchange, her interest now unmistakable. Mr. Blackwell, noting her presence with alarm, took his wife's arm firmly. "Victoria, we need to greet the Andersons," he said with forced joviality. "Mrs. Thompson, we'll continue this discussion another time." As they retreated, Mabel snorted softly. "That woman has the warmth of a freezer burn." "And half the charm," added Ida May, linking her arm through mine. "You're doing wonderfully, Ellie. How are you feeling?" "Surprisingly calm," I admitted. "I expected to be more nervous, but now that I'm here, it feels right. Like I'm finally standing up for something important." "You are," she assured me. "Now let's head to that reception. If the ceremony was any indication, the main event is yet to come." Together, our small group made our way toward the grand ballroom, where Edward and Vanessa would soon have to face the mother who refused to be erased from their carefully curated fantasy. The grand ballroom of the Blackwell estate had been transformed into a vision from a luxury wedding magazine. Crystal chandeliers cast a soft glow over tables adorned with elaborate floral centerpieces. A string orchestra played from a raised platform, and waitstaff in formal attire circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvre. Everything was perfect, precisely as the Blackwells had planned, except for my presence. Following the escort cards, our small group made our way to table 1, prominently positioned near the head table where Edward and Vanessa would sit with their wedding party. Mrs. Blackwell watched our approach with barely concealed horror, while her husband spoke urgently to the event coordinator, who kept shaking her head apologetically. "I believe they're trying to have our seating rearranged," Ida May observed quietly. "But it's too late. The place cards are printed, the tables are set, and guests are already being seated." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of calm as we took our assigned places. The table settings were exquisite: fine china, crystal stemware, silver that I myself had polished earlier in the week. The irony wasn't lost on me. Other guests began to fill the remaining seats at our table, introducing themselves politely. When asked about my relationship to the couple, I answered simply and truthfully, "I'm Edward's mother." The responses varied from surprised glances to warm congratulations. One elderly gentleman, apparently a distant Blackwell cousin, remarked, "I didn't realize Edward was from Charleston society. Victoria never mentioned—" "Oh, we're not from Charleston," I replied pleasantly. "I raised Edward in Magnolia Creek, about an hour from here. I worked as a housekeeper to put him through medical school." The gentleman's eyebrows rose slightly, but to his credit, his smile never faltered. "How remarkable," he said. "You must be very proud." "I am," I confirmed, "though perhaps not as proud as I once was." Before he could inquire further, the orchestra swelled, and the master of ceremonies announced the entrance of the wedding party. Bridesmaids and groomsmen entered in pairs, followed by Edward and Vanessa, holding hands and smiling for the photographer. As they made their way to the head table, Edward's eyes swept the room, inevitably landing on me. For a brief moment, something flashed across his face. Shame, recognition, perhaps even a hint of the little boy I had raised. Then Vanessa squeezed his hand, and he turned away, focusing on the guests who had risen to applaud their entrance. The first course was served, and conversation flowed around our table, though I remained relatively quiet, observing the room. The Blackwells were working overtime, moving from table to table, clearly trying to control whatever narrative was developing about my presence. But the curious glances directed our way told me that word was spreading among the guests. The groom's mother was not the socially connected figure they had been led to believe, but a housekeeper who had somehow secured a place at the family table. When the time came for toasts, Mr. Blackwell rose first, glass in hand. His speech was polished and witty, filled with anecdotes about Vanessa's childhood and subtle references to the couple's bright future in Charleston society. Not once did he acknowledge me or mention Edward's upbringing. The best man spoke next, sharing stories from medical school and praising Edward's dedication to his patients. Again, no mention of the woman who had sacrificed everything to put him through that medical school. As the applause for the best man's toast faded, the master of ceremonies announced, "And now a special toast from the mother of the groom." A hush fell over the room. This was clearly not on the program. Mrs. Blackwell's face went rigid with alarm, while Edward nearly dropped his champagne glass. All eyes turned to me as I rose from my seat, champagne flute in hand. "For those who don't know me," I began, my voice steady and clear, "I'm Eleanor Thompson, Edward's mother. I wasn't originally included in the wedding plans. In fact, my invitation described me as house staff rather than mother of the groom. But I couldn't miss this important day in my son's life." The room was utterly silent now, guests frozen in various states of shock and fascination. Edward stared at me, his face pale, while Vanessa clutched his arm tightly. I raised Edward alone after his father died when he was just 3 months old. I worked 3 jobs to give him every opportunity, cleaning other people's homes so he could have a home of his own, polishing other people's silver so he could have what he needed for school. Everything I had, everything I earned went to building his future. I paused, looking directly at Edward. "I'm not here to embarrass you, Edward. I'm here because I love you, and because the son I raised would never be ashamed of where he came from, or the mother who sacrificed everything for him." That son understood that a person's worth isn't measured by their social standing or bank account, but by their integrity, their compassion, their willingness to stand up for what's right. Tears welled in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I don't know if that son still exists somewhere inside the man sitting before me today, but I'm here because I have to believe he does. I raised my glass. To Edward and Vanessa. May your marriage be built on truth, mutual respect, and genuine love, not appearances or social advantage. And may you both remember that true class has nothing to do with money or status, and everything to do with how you treat people who can do nothing for you. As I took a sip from my glass, the room remained stunned into silence. Then, from somewhere in the back, a single person began to applaud. Others joined in, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum until most of the room was applauding, not out of social obligation, but in genuine appreciation of the truth they had just witnessed. The applause eventually faded, but the impact of my words lingered in the ballroom like a thunderclap's echo. As I returned to my seat, the orchestra hastily began to play, trying to restore the celebratory atmosphere. Waiters hurried to serve the main course, and conversation gradually resumed, though now with a distinctly different energy, hushed discussions and furtive glances toward both me and the head table. Edward sat motionless, staring at his plate, while Vanessa whispered urgently in his ear. Mrs. Blackwell had turned an alarming shade of crimson, fanning herself vigorously while her husband signaled for more champagne. The carefully choreographed perfection of their event had been irreparably disrupted, not by a scene or a confrontation, but by the simple truth spoken aloud. That, Ida May whispered, squeezing my hand under the table, was magnificent. Mabel nodded in agreement. About time someone around here spoke some honest words. I felt strangely light, as if a burden I'd carried for years had finally been set down. Whatever happened next, I had reclaimed my dignity and spoken my truth. Edward could choose to acknowledge it or continue denying it, but he could no longer pretend I didn't exist. As the meal progressed, I noticed the Southern Living photographer discreetly capturing images of our table. The editor was deep in conversation with Marjorie, whose resignation from the Blackwell household had apparently freed her to share certain insights. From their animated expressions and occasional glances my way, I suspected the wedding feature might be evolving into something quite different from what the Blackwells had envisioned. When the dancing began, I remained at our table, not wanting to push my presence further than necessary. The first dance between the newlyweds was a picture of strained elegance, Edward going through the motions with mechanical precision, Vanessa's smile fixed and brittle. I felt a pang of sadness watching them. This should have been a joyful moment, not one clouded by deception and its exposure. After the obligatory dances concluded, guests began to mingle more freely. Several approached our table, curious about the woman who had delivered such an unexpected toast. Most were polite, even warm, expressing admiration for my dedication to my son's education. A few shared their own stories of humble beginnings or parents who had sacrificed for them. The narrative was shifting before my eyes. What the Blackwells had tried to frame as shameful was being recognized as admirable by many of their guests. I was chatting with a kind elderly woman who had worked as a teacher for 40 years when I sensed someone approaching from behind. Turning, I found Edward standing there, his expression a complex mixture of emotions I couldn't fully decipher. "Mom?" he said, his voice strained. "May I speak with you? Privately?" I nodded and excused myself, following him to a small anteroom off the main ballroom. He closed the door behind us, then stood awkwardly, as if unsure how to begin. "That was quite a toast," he finally said. "It was the truth," I replied simply. He ran a hand through his carefully styled hair, disrupting its perfection. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The Blackwells are humiliated. Vanessa is in tears. The hospital board members are asking questions I can't answer. I didn't mention the Blackwells in my toast, Edward. I spoke only about you and me, and the values I tried to instill in you. If they're humiliated, perhaps it's because their own values don't stand up to scrutiny." He paced the small room, agitation evident in every movement. "This isn't just about values, Mom. It's about relationships, connections, opportunities. Mr. Blackwell was going to help secure my position on the hospital board. Now he's barely speaking to me." "Because your mother is a housekeeper?" I asked. "Or because you lied about it? Because I suspect it's the deception, not the truth, that has caused the real damage today." Edward stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping slightly. "You don't understand their world." "No," I agreed. "And from what I've seen this week, I don't want to. It's a world built on appearances and social hierarchies, where people are valued for their connections rather than their character." I stepped closer to him. "But that's not the world I raised you for, Edward. I raised you to be honest, to work hard, to treat everyone with respect, regardless of their position." "I do respect you," he insisted, but his eyes couldn't meet mine. "Respect isn't just words, Edward. It's actions. Inviting your mother to your wedding as a guest, not staff. Being honest about your background instead of creating elaborate fictions. Not plotting to sell her home without her knowledge." He flinched at that last point. "How did you—" "I told you. I heard everything while working here this week. The Blackwells aren't as discreet as they think when the help is around." Edward leaned against the wall, suddenly looking exhausted. "What do you want from me, Mom? What would make this right?" The question caught me off guard. What did I want? Not revenge or public humiliation. Not even an apology, though that would be a start. What I truly wanted was something no confrontation could guarantee. I want my son back, I said simply. The one who understood that dignity isn't bestowed by social status, but earned through one's actions. The one who was proud of his mother's hard work, not ashamed of it. Edward was silent for a long moment, seemingly wrestling with himself. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I don't know if I can be that person anymore. I don't know if I even remember how. The admission, painful as it was, felt like the first honest thing he'd said to me in years. Not a defense or a justification, but a recognition of how far he had strayed from himself. That's a start, I said softly. Honesty, even difficult honesty, is always a start. A knock at the door interrupted us. Vanessa entered without waiting for a response, her face tight with controlled fury. Edward, your presence is required. The Andersons are asking about the hospital expansion plans. She barely acknowledged me with a curt nod before turning back to Edward. Now, Edward, we need to salvage what we can from this situation. He hesitated, looking between us as if physically caught between two worlds, the authentic one he had come from and the artificial one he was struggling to join. Go, I told him gently. It's your wedding day. We can talk more another time. As he followed Vanessa out the door, he paused briefly. Mom, Whatever he wanted to say remained unspoken as Vanessa pulled him back into the ballroom, back into the performance their life together had become. I remained in the anteroom for a moment, collecting myself. The conversation had been difficult, but necessary. Edward was still lost in the Blackwell's world, but perhaps a small crack had appeared in the facade he had constructed, a space where truth might eventually find its way in. When I rejoined my friends at our table, I found the reception beginning to wind down. Many guests had already departed, including some of the hospital board members Edward had been so concerned about impressing. The Blackwells were engaged in damage control, moving from group to group with strained smiles and hushed explanations. Ready to leave? Ida May asked gently. You've accomplished what you came to do. I nodded, suddenly feeling the emotional toll of the day. Yes, I think it's time. As we gathered our things, the Southern Living editor approached our table, her professional smile not quite concealing her journalistic interest. Mrs. Thompson, I'm Catherine Wilson from Southern Living. I wonder if I might have a word with you sometime. Your story is quite remarkable. I smiled politely, but shook my head. I'm not interested in publicity, Ms. Wilson. I came today only to be present for my son's wedding, nothing more. Of course, she replied, handing me her business card nonetheless. But if you change your mind, I'd be honored to share your story. It's not often we encounter such genuine dignity in these social circles. I thanked her, but tucked the card away with no intention of using it. My purpose had never been to expose or embarrass the Blackwells publicly, only to ensure that Edward could not completely erase me from his life or exploit my home for his social climbing. As we made our way toward the exit, I caught sight of Mrs. Blackwell intercepting Marjorie in a corner, her face contorted with rage as she berated her former assistant. Marjorie stood tall, no longer the deferential employee but a woman who had clearly liberated herself from the Blackwells' influence. When she spotted me watching, she gave me a subtle nod of solidarity before turning back to her former employer. With newfound confidence, outside Harold was waiting with the car as promised. As we drove away from the Blackwell estate, I gazed back at the imposing mansion growing smaller in the distance. Just days ago, I had scrubbed its floors and polished its silver. Today, I had walked its halls as a guest and spoken my truth within its walls. The symmetry felt right somehow. A closing of a circle. What happens now? Mabel asked as we turned onto the main road. Now I go home, I replied simply. The legal protections for my house are in place. Edward knows I'm aware of his plans. My part in this drama is done. And Edward? Ida May asked carefully. What about your relationship with him? I gazed out the window at the passing landscape, considering her question. That's up to Edward. Now, I've extended my hand. He can choose to take it or not. I can't force him to be the son I raised, to remember the values I tried to instill. He has to want that for himself. The car fell silent as my friends absorbed this. Finally, Mabel spoke up. Well, I for one am proud of you, Ellie Thompson. You showed those fancy folks what real class looks like today. I smiled at her words, feeling a quiet pride in what I had accomplished. Not a dramatic confrontation or public humiliation, but a simple statement of truth that forced Edward and the Blackwells to face reality, however briefly. In the days that followed, I waited for some communication from Edward. A phone call, a letter, even an angry confrontation. But there was nothing. The silence spoke volumes about the choice he had made, at least for now. A week after the wedding, I received a formal letter from James Whitaker. The Blackwells' attorney had contacted him regarding my house, inquiring about the legal protections I had put in place. James had informed them in no uncertain terms that any attempt to pressure or manipulate me regarding my property would result in immediate legal action. According to James, the matter had been dropped immediately. That same day, I signed the partnership papers with Ida May, officially becoming co-owner of Johnson Estate Services. My years of experience and reputation for excellence would help expand the business beyond Charleston, creating opportunities for other women like us, women who took pride in their work, regardless of how others might view it. As I stood in my living room that evening, gazing at the photos of Edward that still adorned my mantel, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and peace. The son I had raised might be lost to me, at least for now. But I had reclaimed myself, my dignity, my sense of worth, my right to be acknowledged rather than erased. And perhaps someday, when the Blackwells' influence had faded or their true nature had become apparent to him, Edward would remember who he really was. The door would remain open, but I would no longer wait beside it, putting my life on hold for a recognition that might never come. It was time to live for myself. 6 months after Edward's wedding, my life had transformed in ways I never could have imagined. Johnson Estate Services had doubled its client list, with Ida May handling the business operations while I focused on training our staff. We specialized in what we called heritage housekeeping, the proper care of antiques, heirlooms, and fine furnishings. Our reputation for excellence had spread throughout Charleston's elite circles, and ironically, we now commanded premium rates from the very families who might once have looked down on us. The Blackwells were not among our clients. My modest home had undergone changes too. With my newfound financial security, I'd made improvements I'd long postponed: a new roof, updated appliances, a small garden patio where I could enjoy my morning coffee. But I hadn't sold or moved, despite now being able to afford something grander. This house held the memories of my life with Robert and raising Edward. It was mine, truly mine, and I no longer felt any need to apologize for its simplicity or justify my attachment to it. I was enjoying this peaceful evening on my new patio, watching the sunset with a glass of iced tea, when I heard a car pull into my driveway. Through the trellis of climbing roses, I caught a glimpse of a familiar figure approaching my front door. Edward. I hadn't seen or heard from him since the wedding, though I'd followed his life from a distance through mutual acquaintances. The honeymoon in Europe had been cut short. He and Vanessa had moved into a modest condominium rather than the riverside house they'd coveted. And most notably, the hospital board position had gone to another doctor. Apparently, questions about character and transparency had been raised during the selection process. I remained seated, letting him knock and wait, giving myself time. to prepare for whatever this visit might bring. When I finally rounded the house to greet him, he looked startled by my appearance. I realized he was seeing me through new eyes, not as his housekeeper mother in practical clothes with work-worn hands, but as a successful businesswoman in a casual but elegant outfit, looking more rested and confident than I had in years. "Mom," he said, his voice uncertain, "you look different." "I am different," I replied simply. "Would you like to come in?" He followed me through the house, his eyes taking in the subtle changes: new curtains, reupholstered furniture, fresh paint. We settled in the living room, where photos of him still held places of honor despite everything that had transpired. "I heard about your business with Mrs. Johnson," he said, breaking the awkward silence. "Congratulations." "Thank you. It's been rewarding." I studied him as we spoke, noting the changes in him as well. He looked thinner, tired around the eyes, less polished than he had on his wedding day. "How are you and Vanessa?" He glanced down at his hands. "We're adjusting." The Blackwells weren't pleased about how things unfolded at the wedding. Mr. Blackwell withdrew some of his promises regarding my career advancement. I nodded, not surprised. "And your house plans?" "On hold indefinitely," he admitted. "The Riverside property went to another buyer. We're making do with the condo for now." The conversation lapsed into silence again. I waited, sensing he hadn't come merely to exchange pleasantries or life updates. "I've been doing a lot of thinking, Mom," he finally said, his voice quiet but steady. "About what you said at the wedding. About the person I used to be. The son you raised." I remained silent, giving him space to continue. "I don't like who I've become," he confessed, the words seeming to cost him considerable effort. "Trying to be what the Blackwells wanted, hiding who I really am, where I came from. It's exhausting. And the worst part is, I'm not even sure it's worth it anymore." "What does Vanessa think about all this?" I asked carefully. "She's struggling too. The life her parents promised us hasn't materialized. We're finding out the hard way that their influence and wealth weren't exactly what they appeared to be." He paused, meeting my eyes directly for the first time. "You tried to tell me that, didn't you? That day when you came to the house before the wedding." I nodded. "I discovered quite a lot while cleaning their home. But you weren't ready to hear it then." "No," he agreed. "I wasn't." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I came to apologize, Mom. Not just for the wedding, but for everything. For being ashamed of you. For lying about who you were. For trying to use your home to prop up my fantasy. Life with the Blackwells. I was wrong. So wrong." The apology was what I had hoped for, but had stopped expecting. Yet, now that it had come, I found myself cautious, wondering if this was another moment of manipulation. Perhaps the Blackwells' financial situation had worsened, and Edward needed my help again. "What is it you want from me now, Edward?" I asked. Directly. He looked surprised, then saddened by my suspicion. "Nothing, Mom. I don't expect your forgiveness, and I'm not here to ask for money or favors. I just needed you to know that I understand what I did, and I'm truly sorry for it." As he spoke, I searched his face for signs of the son I had raised, the honest, kind-hearted boy who had existed before ambition and social climbing had twisted his values. For the first time in years, I thought I glimpsed that person again, in his eyes. Edward's apology hung in the air between us, sincere but fragile. I had imagined this moment so many times, my son recognizing his mistakes, returning to the values I had taught him. Yet now that it had arrived, I found myself uncertain how to respond. "I appreciate your apology," I finally said. "But rebuilding trust takes time, Edward. It's not accomplished in a single conversation." He nodded, accepting this truth without protest. "I know. I don't expect things to go back to how they were. Too much has happened. He glanced around the living room, his eyes lingering on a photo of himself in his white coat at medical school graduation. I just miss who I was before. All this. Before I started believing that status and connections were more important than integrity and hard work. That person still exists, I told him. Beneath all the pretense and social climbing, the doctor who wanted to help people, the boy who understood the value of honest work, he's still there. The question is whether you're willing to reclaim him, even if it means giving up the life you thought you wanted. Edward was silent for a long moment, considering my words. I'm trying, he finally said. It's not easy. Vanessa and we're redefining what we want, what matters. Her parents are pressuring us to maintain appearances, to keep playing the game, but we're starting to question whether it's worth the cost. And what do you think? I asked, my voice gentle now. I think, he said slowly, that I've never been more miserable than when I was trying to be someone I'm not, when I was ashamed of you, the person who sacrificed everything for me. His voice cracked slightly. I think I'd rather be a doctor who comes from honest working-class roots than a social climber who denies his own mother. For the first time that evening, I reached across and took his hand. It was a small gesture, but a significant one. A tentative bridge across the chasm that had grown between us. The door is open, Edward, I said softly. It always has been. But you need to walk through it yourself, in your own time, for your own reasons. Not because the Blackwells disappointed you, or because their promises fell through, but because you genuinely want to reclaim the person you were meant to be. Squeezed my hand, tears gathering in his eyes. I know, and I will. We talked for another hour, not about the wedding or the Blackwells, but about his work at the hospital, about my business partnership with Ida May, about ordinary things that mattered. When he finally rose to leave, something had shifted between us. Not a complete restoration of what was lost, but a tentative beginning of something new. Can I come again next week? He asked at the door. Maybe for dinner? Vanessa might come too, if that's okay. She has some things she'd like to say to you as well. I'd like that, I replied, and I meant it. After he left, I returned to my patio, watching as the last rays of sunset faded into twilight. The garden I'd planted was just beginning to bloom, new life emerging from soil I'd tended with my own hands. How fitting, I thought, that growth often requires disturbance, the turning of soil, the breaking of seed casings, the difficult emergence into light. My confrontation with Edward at the wedding had been painful, but perhaps necessary for this new beginning. Looking back on the journey that had brought me here, I could trace the path from pain to clarity, from betrayal to self-reclamation. The housekeeper who had once been ashamed to attend her son's wedding had become a woman who stood firmly in her own worth, who had built a successful business from the very skills others had dismissed. The wisdom I had gained came not from books or education, but from lived experience. True dignity isn't granted by social position or wealth, but by how we treat others and ourselves. Real respect can't be demanded or purchased. It must be earned through integrity and authenticity. And sometimes, the greatest act of love is not endless sacrifice, but standing firmly for the truth, even when it's unwelcome. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I felt a deep peace settle over me. Whatever happened with Edward going forward, whether our relationship fully healed or not, I had found my own path. I had reclaimed myself. And that, I realized, had been the most important journey all along. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.